I was kneeling beside the missing hiker when a roar rolled up from the bottom of the valley. It was so deep that the water in the metal bottle by my boot trembled. Caleb clamped his hand around my wrist, his nails digging through my wet glove. Across the clearing, mist-covered trees began swaying one after another, even though the wind had stopped. My teammate raised his flashlight, but Caleb immediately pushed the gun barrel down. He stared into the forest and whispered that the creature out there had kept him alive all night. Then a gigantic creature appeared right behind us. Hello everyone, I'm Victor, and today we're entering a strange story said to have unfolded in the fog-covered forests of the Great Smoky Mountains. Our editorial team compiled this account from witness stories, forums, blogs, rescue records, and Bigfoot research communities. We cannot verify every detail, so listen with an open mind and draw your own conclusion. Ethan Walker, a veteran search and rescue ranger in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, was assigned to find Caleb Mercer, a young hiker missing near an abandoned trail east of Mount LeConte. Heavy rain had erased most tracks, helicopters were grounded, and Ethan had to enter the forest with a younger ranger, Mason Reed. During the search, the two men found branches broken at impossible heights, human-like footprints nearly 20 inches long, and Caleb's belongings arranged like directional markers. When they finally found him injured, they discovered that a huge, unknown creature had brought him water and food, and had built a windbreak to keep him alive through the night. The rescue soon became a tense journey. The creature continued, guiding them, warned them away from danger, and even drove off a bear approaching the group. Later, Ethan uncovered forgotten park reports describing similar rescues. A recovered photograph from Caleb's camera suggested the creature had been watching from the beginning, raising a darker question. Did Bigfoot save people out of compassion or for a purpose humans still could not understand? Before the story begins, tell us what city or state you are watching from, and if you have ever seen something in the forest that you still cannot explain, share it below. Your experience may resemble what happened here. Now let us return to late October, when Ranger Ethan Walker received what first seemed like an ordinary missing person call. Late one October afternoon, Ethan was in the equipment room at Sugarland Station, checking medical kits after a trail injury, when dispatcher Nora Whitfield called him into operations. Her voice was calm, but the map already open on the screen showed the urgency. Caleb Mercer, 28, from Knoxville, had failed to contact his mother after hiking alone near Mount LeConte. He had registered a route along Boulevard Trail and carried rain gear, a light sleeping bag, a water filter, and a camera. He always reported changes of plan, had no serious medical condition, and had promised to call before dark. His final phone signal came from the edge of a valley, east of the main route, close to an old forestry trail abandoned for years. Reaching that location would have required him to leave his registered path deliberately. Ethan called Caleb's mother, confirmed his clothing, boots, food, and equipment, then watched storm clouds settle over the mountains. Mason Reed was assigned to accompany him. Mason was strong, fast, and skilled in first aid, but still inexperienced and inclined to assume missing hikers had simply overestimated themselves. Heavy rain was expected within 2 hours, with nighttime temperatures near freezing. Nora wanted to wait for more personnel and begin at dawn. Ethan refused. If Caleb was wet, injured, and unable to shelter himself, a few hours could decide whether he survived. Just then, Nora recovered part of an unsent message from Caleb's phone. There is someone out. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall. A vehicle carried Ethan and Mason toward the access point near Newfound Gap, beneath a lead-gray sky. 2 other rangers joined them briefly, carrying ropes, thermal blankets, and medical gear, then split north to check a parallel route. Ethan clipped his radio to his shoulder, fixed a lamp to his helmet, and entered the forest. Within minutes, the rain intensified, washing mud across roots and covering tracks with wet maple leaves. Mason said any trail Caleb had left would soon disappear. Ethan said nothing. He knelt beside a root, brushed away leaves, and found a fresh slide mark. Mud clung to the inner side of a low branch, consistent with someone grabbing it after slipping. Farther ahead, he found part of a boot print, matching Caleb's footwear. The trail led toward the abandoned path instead of the nearest shelter. Ethan noticed repeated pauses in Caleb's movement, as if he had stopped to watch something away from the trail. At the final phone location, the helicopter pilot radioed that clouds had dropped too low, and air support was returning to base. Ethan marked the coordinates and examined 4 parallel grooves in nearby bark. Mason suggested knife marks, but the grooves were wider than a normal blade, and the bark looked torn away by uneven force. They descended into thicker rhododendron. Half an hour later, Ethan stopped beneath a branch as thick as his wrist, snapped more than 10 feet above the ground. Fresh sap still shone on the break. There were no claw marks and no similar storm damage nearby. Directly below, it was a long depression in the mud. Ethan placed his rescue knife beside it. The print measured almost 20 inches. The next one was more than 6 feet away. Ethan photographed the print with a scale marker and tried to send the image to base, but the radio returned only static. Rain and rock walls had created a dead zone. He tied reflective tape to the tree and followed the huge tracks. They vanished over stone and roots, then reappeared whenever the ground softened, always continuing along the same line. Several strides exceeded 6 feet. Mason argued that rain had stretched ordinary boot marks, but Ethan saw equal depth in each impression, suggesting a heavy 2-legged creature. They entered the overgrown forestry trail, where rhododendron pressed against their faces. Leaves had been pushed aside in a path wider than a man's shoulders, and the canopy was disturbed above head height, as though something tall had passed without crouching. Mason wanted to turn back before dark. Ethan was considering it when he saw blue fabric caught on thorns, matching Caleb's jacket. Farther on, they found a slide in the leaves, diluted blood and fresh bark damage at hip height. Caleb had fallen and struck a tree, but there was no evidence of a deep drop or dragging. Ethan shouted his name. 3 dry knocks answered from the valley below. Mason blamed branches, so Ethan struck a tree 3 times with his hatchet handle. 2 stronger knocks came from the opposite slope. Something heavy moved behind the rhododendron. Ethan called again. A short whistle crossed the ravine. He answered with a standard rescue signal. The hidden sound copied it perfectly, then fell into a deep vibration that made Mason tighten his grip on the bear spray. The low vibration disappeared into the rain before Ethan could locate it. Mason again recommended retreating, but Caleb's torn fabric and the tracks continued downhill. Ethan agreed to proceed only a short distance, keeping close together. They roped themselves while crossing a dry, slippery gully. On the far side, Ethan found a black glove hanging at shoulder height. Its inside was drier than its outer surface, as though someone had placed it there after the rain began. The ground beneath showed no sign Caleb had fallen. 30 yards later, Mason's light caught orange fabric on a fallen tree. Caleb's backpack had been placed neatly, with both straps folded inward and every zipper closed. Inside, the phone was dead, the first aid kit had been opened, 2 painkillers were missing, and half a roll of ankle tape had been used. His dry clothing, food, and sleeping bag remained. The camera was gone. A muddy streak crossed Caleb's paper map toward the southwest, like a finger marking the valley. Mason suggested an illegal camper had helped him, but Ethan asked why any rescuer would abandon survival supplies in such an obvious display. They followed the mark. On a flat rock stood Caleb's water bottle, capped and almost full. 3 stones beside it formed a line pointing into deeper forest. The ground beneath the stones was still dry, proving they had been arranged after the storm started. Broken, high branches, the displayed glove, the orderly backpack, and the upright bottle all formed a deliberate trail for rescuers. Behind the rock, Ethan found another enormous five-toed footprint. At its front edge lay half of Caleb's boot print. The larger foot had come later and had shifted aside to avoid stepping directly on the human track. Night closed over the slope until their helmet lamps became the only light among black, wet trunks. Ethan tied more reflective tape and told Mason they had 20 minutes before they must shelter. The temperature dropped while rain ran down their collars. Ethan called Caleb's name repeatedly. The third call brought a weak moan from ahead. Echoes made it seem to move between rock faces. Mason chose a narrow path on the right, but Ethan noticed that every broken branch pointed left. He stopped Mason just before his boot landed on leaves covering a deep fissure. A small stone dropped from the opposite slope and landed beside Ethan. His beam found only fog, but fresh mud marked a chestnut trunk nearly 8 feet high, like a handprint. Something above them was watching. They took the left path. The moan grew clearer while heavy footsteps moved parallel to them, beyond the light, stopping whenever they stopped. Mason blew a rescue whistle. A ragged human shout answered. Then a deep tone rolled through the trees, shaking water from leaves. They pushed through the last rhododendron wall into a small clearing. Caleb sat against a boulder, his right leg stiff, clothing torn, face pale. Pine and rhododendron branches formed a low windbreak around him. Dry leaves insulated the ground beneath him. A metal bottle stood beside his hand, and nuts rested on a piece of bark. Caleb saw their ranger patches, but looked past Mason's shoulder, tracking something in the mist. Ethan knelt, introduced himself, and checked his breathing. Caleb seized his wrist and whispered that they were late. When Ethan asked who had come before them, Caleb stared into the forest and said the giant had found him the previous night and was probably still standing behind them. Ethan spun, sweeping his light across foggy trunks. Nothing remained except trembling leaves. Mason checked the perimeter while Ethan assessed Caleb. The right ankle was badly swollen beneath a rough wrap. His pulse was fast, lips pale, fingers cold, but he was alert and knew the time and place. The bottle held water. Ethan let him drink slowly and wrapped him in a thermal blanket. The shelter was carefully designed. Pine and rhododendron woven into a low curve, leaves facing outward against rain, dry ground cover taken from beneath fallen trees, and the open side protected from the cold valley wind. Whoever built it understood survival in wet mountain forest. Nearby lay berries, nuts, and dry twigs. Caleb said the creature had placed them in front of him, retreated beyond the light, and watched. Mason found at least 8 huge tracks forming a perimeter 10 to 20 yards away, none crossing the windbreak. Caleb explained that he had left the trail after hearing a whistle like a person calling for help. He saw a tall shape behind rhododendron, slipped on wet rock and struck a tree. Around midnight, heavy footsteps circled him. A 2-legged creature, taller than the brush, with broad shoulders and arms near its knees, approached. It stopped several yards away, opened its hands, and looked down, almost as if trying to seem less threatening. Mason asked whether Caleb had hit his head or used drugs or alcohol. Caleb pointed at the shelter and asked Mason who else had built it. Ethan ended the argument. He examined a branch placed outside the ring. Bare tooth marks were on one end, but that end faced away from Caleb, as if deliberately marking a boundary. 3 knocks sounded from the north. Caleb said the creature only made that signal when something else was approaching. A heavy rustle came through the northern rhododendron, followed by slow snorting. Food scents had attracted a black bear. Mason sealed the berries and nuts in an odor-proof bag while Ethan moved in front of Caleb. The bear emerged, wet fur clinging to its body, nose aimed toward the bark plate. It rose briefly to scent the air and advanced. Mason raised bear spray. Ethan spoke firmly and spread the thermal blanket to make the group appear larger. The bear stopped, but it was no longer watching them. It stared past their shoulders into the trees. Its ears flattened, shoulder fur rose, and claws dug into the mud. A compressed, chest-deep sound came from the darkness. The bear turned instantly and fled downhill. Branches shook along its retreat, while something much larger shifted position on the opposite side. Mason insisted a bigger bear had asserted dominance, but Caleb said this had happened repeatedly overnight. Whenever claws or light footsteps approached, the giant knocked on trees, gave a low call, and circled the shelter until the forest became quiet. Ethan knew they had to move. The ground could become a drainage channel, and Caleb's ankle was worsening. He and Mason splinted the leg, slid a soft stretcher under Caleb, and secured him. Caleb warned them to limit metal noise, because the creature withdrew whenever his cup struck stone. As Mason lifted his equipment, a carabiner fell against a rock. A violent blow shook a tree to the east. Mason suggested firing a flare, but Caleb objected. At the edge of the clearing, Ethan discovered a new line of stones arranged as an arrow pointing south. Their planned route led east. The map showed the east route as shorter, while south would descend to a creek and add nearly a mile. Mason claimed the stones might have been there before the storm. Ethan lifted them. Their tops were wet, but the soil beneath remained dry. Remembering the earlier warnings and markers, he chose south. Mason disagreed but helped carry Caleb. The southern path was easier than expected. Rhododendron branches had been bent aside, and small trunks lay across steep sections like steps. It looked prepared after the creature heard rescuers approaching. At the creek, however, the mapped wooden bridge had collapsed. Mason accused Ethan of wasting time. 50 yards downstream, they found 2 large trees lying parallel across the rising water. Their roots still held, but both trunks had been snapped about 5 feet above the ground. The exposed wood was fresh and dry. Human strength could not have built such a crossing so quickly. They added ropes and moved across while floodwater shook the trunks. Halfway over, Ethan glimpsed a huge, dark-haired hand gripping another tree upstream. It vanished before he could warn Mason. A knock sounded behind them. Caleb called it a warning. Seconds after the group reached the far bank, a muddy surge swept through the place they had just crossed and tore away the remains of the old bridge. They sheltered beneath a low rock overhang south of the creek. Caleb's toes were colder and responding slowly, so Ethan loosened the bandage and restored circulation before moving again. He noticed Caleb hiding something inside his jacket and asked about the missing camera. Caleb produced a scratched, waterlogged camera. He admitted the memory card might contain a photograph of the creature. Mason demanded to know why he had hidden it. Caleb said he feared Sowers would start hunting the animal instead of saving him. Ethan promised their mission remained rescue and asked for the full truth. Caleb confessed that at dusk he had seen a huge figure behind a tree. When he raised the camera, the flash fired and the creature retreated. Instead of returning to the trail, Caleb followed it, shouting and even throwing a rock to force it into the open for another picture. He kept going until he slipped. Mason angrily reminded him how many people were now in danger because of a photograph. Caleb admitted his stupidity, but said the creature could have abandoned him. Instead, it returned with water, food, and shelter. The camera itself had fallen nearly 10 feet away, yet appeared beside his hand the next morning. A deep indentation marked the strap, as if a giant hand had held it. Mason used tweezers to remove a 6-inch brown-black hair caught in the stitching. Ethan sealed the hair and memory card. Caleb then said the strangest thing was that the creature had once made a sound like his name. Across the creek, through the roar of rising water, a rough voice slowly formed the syllables. Ka-leb. They did not answer. Ethan could not tell whether the sound was communication, mimicry, or a test. The group continued south through thick spruce and ground-level fog. Heavy footsteps remained above them, stopping when they stopped. Mason called the unseen presence the fourth member of the team, no longer joking. Half an hour later, two large branches formed an X across the trail. Ethan checked ahead with a pole and felt the ground tremble. Floodwater had hollowed out the old path beneath a thin crust of wet leaves. As he backed away, the edge collapsed into darkness. The X had been a warning. They climbed higher over slippery roots, carrying Caleb with difficulty. At a chestnut tree, a bundle of dry leaves rolled down from above. Inside were resinous twigs suitable for fire. Mason wondered whether a predator might also guide prey away from danger, only to keep it inside its territory. Ethan refused to use a flare. Every sign so far had preserved their lives. Caleb suddenly stared toward a rock ledge. In the fog stood a giant black figure, shoulders broad, arms long, amber eyes reflecting. It looked at Caleb, then Ethan raised one arm and pointed behind the rescue team. Ethan turned just as a second shape, lower and faster, crawled between trees less than 50 yards away. The lower shape vanished before Mason could track it. The giant on the ledge struck 3 heavy knocks, apparently signaling toward the moving figure. A high hiss answered from near the ground. Rhododendron shook in a wide arc downhill. Caleb admitted he had heard that hiss during the night. A lean, gray-brown body had crawled toward him, breathing rapidly, until the larger creature stepped between them and drove it off with tree blows. He had blamed the memory on fever. Ethan now understood that the large tracks around the shelter were a protective patrol, while low scratches and confused movement belonged to the second creature. Blood from Caleb's ankle may have attracted it. Ethan replaced the dressing and sealed the bloody gauze. Mason asked why one member of the same species would protect a human from another. Ethan had no answer. It could involve territory, young, status, or social behavior unknown to people. Whatever the cause, the large creature had chosen to shield Caleb. In mud near the tree, Ethan found blood smeared more than 7 feet above the ground, leading toward the ledge. Their guide was injured. The aggressive creature remained strong, while the protector was weakening. As they left the slope, radio static began breaking into fragments of signal. Ethan finally reached Nora and reported Caleb alive with a serious ankle injury. A 6-person team led by Laura Kim was climbing from Alum Cave Trail and could meet them at an old patrol point in about 3 hours. Helicopters would remain grounded until morning. Ethan warned that large animals were active nearby and asked the approaching team to limit whistles, flares, and metal noise. At a temporary rest stop, Mason found a fresh human boot print outside their trail. He assumed the support team was near, but Nora did not respond. Then a female voice called Ethan's name from the north, sounding almost exactly like Nora, except for an awkwardly stretched ending. Nora had only used Ethan's radio code. The forest voice had heard the transmission and repeated it. Another direction produced the word help in Caleb's own voice. Ethan established a password with Laura, Blue Ridge 7, accompanied by 2 short light flashes and 1 long. Soon a light appeared between trees in the correct pattern, and a human voice repeated the password. But the light did not illuminate trunks or ground. It floated as 2 reflective points. They moved apart like eyes. A second, lower pair appeared near the forest floor. The low eyes shifted left and right through brush. A lean creature crossed the light. Standing upright, it was nearly 6 feet tall, gray-brown fur-soaked, one flank torn and dark. It focused on the odor-proof bag, holding Caleb's bloody bandages. Ethan threw the bag downhill. The creature chased it briefly, sniffed, then turned back as though it had only tested the humans. Mason sprayed when it approached again. The mist struck its face and shoulder. It screamed and rushed him. Before Ethan could pull Caleb back, a massive impact sounded from above. The larger creature dropped into the clearing and blocked the attacker. Ethan finally saw it clearly. More than 8 feet tall, broad-chested, dark brown fur flattened by rain, flexible human-like fingers, and a bleeding wound along its left side. It ignored the humans and confronted the smaller animal. The fight was mostly posture, eye contact, ground strikes, and positioning. Each time the smaller creature tried to circle toward Caleb, the giant moved to block it, carefully preventing the struggle from reaching the injured man. The attacker withdrew downhill. The larger creature returned, studied Caleb's splint, picked up a branch, placed it pointing southeast, and backed away. Before leaving, it pressed a hand to its bleeding chest and pointed at Caleb. To Ethan, the meaning was simple: take the injured man out of here. The southeast direction matched an old patrol route leading toward Laura's team. Although removed from tourist maps after landslides, it was shorter. Ethan followed the guidance. Caleb worried about the creature's wound and admitted guilt. If he had not chased it for a picture, it would not have guarded him, fought another animal, and suffered injury. Mason warned against assuming human motives. Territorial defense could look like compassion. Ethan agreed that intention remained unknown, but the result was undeniable. Caleb lived. Along the route they found moss and pungent leaves arranged beside blood, suggesting the creature had tried to treat itself. Ethan left water, gauze, and a pressure bandage nearby without approaching. Farther down, the giant occasionally appeared ahead, leaning on trees and breaking branches as markers. Whenever the hiss sounded behind them, it returned to stand between the group and the dark slope. In mud, Ethan found 3 sets of tracks: the guide's huge prints, the aggressive creature's narrower prints, and tiny prints like those of a young one. The conflict might involve family. Then a gunshot cracked from the direction of the meeting point. The injured giant immediately ran toward it. Ethan called Laura while hurrying downhill. Nora confirmed that Laura's team was near the old patrol route and had not reported firing. At the junction, Laura stood with 2 rangers while Grant Ellis aimed a rifle into the forest. A fresh bullet mark scarred a tree behind him. Grant said an 8-foot creature had walked toward the team, and he fired a warning shot. Ethan ordered all weapons lowered. Mason openly confirmed that the creature had guided them around floods and collapses and had protected Caleb. Laura recognized from their behavior that this was not exaggeration. While transferring Caleb to a hard stretcher, 3 knocks came from the east and 2 from the north. Grant raised his rifle again. Ethan stepped in front of it, insisting no creature had attacked them. The team began moving, but a low groan came from the forest. Caleb begged them to stop, fearing the guide had been hit. Ethan handed off the stretcher and followed blood and huge footprints toward a cliff. The bandage supplies he had left were gone. Near a tree lay a second shell casing. Grant swore he had fired only once. Before Ethan could investigate, Laura shouted. The hard stretcher stood empty, every buckle neatly opened. Caleb was gone. Huge footprints led into the fog. The buckles were intact and released in correct order. Caleb could not have freed himself and disappeared so quickly. The giant's tracks were shorter than before, as if it was carrying weight. Grant insisted Caleb had been abducted. Mason argued that the creature had repeatedly saved him. Then, another ranger discovered that Owen Pike, positioned at the rear, was also missing. Grant admitted Owen had fired the second shot after seeing a large shadow and then left formation, seeking a better angle. Laura divided the teams. Grant would search for Owen, while Ethan, Mason, and Laura followed Caleb. Ethan required all rifles on safe and no firing except against an immediate threat. His group carried bear spray, signal lights, and an unloaded rescue gun. The tracks entered an unmapped passage. Blood-marked trunks at chest level, where the injured creature leaned while carrying Caleb. 100 yards later, they found Caleb's camera placed in the center of the trail. Beside it lay a deformed bullet covered in blood. Its caliber matched neither Grant's nor Owen's weapon. Another armed person was ahead of them. A military-style boot print crossed the giant tracks and then ran parallel to the blood trail, stopping at trees with clear shooting angles. Behind camouflage netting, They found a hidden camp against a cliff. It held large-caliber ammunition, food, batteries, radio scanners, and sensor cameras. A map displayed dozens of red circles marking sightings. Printed photographs showed tall figures using the same creek for months. One image showed the lean creature beside a small shape clinging to its leg. Its aggression might be defense of a young one under pressure from a hunter. Behind the shelter, Owen Pike was tied loosely to a tree. After Laura cut him free, he said a camouflaged man had taken his rifle, questioned him about the creature, and tied him when he refused to cooperate. The man had monitored open radio channels and followed the rescue team before they found Caleb. He moved downstream toward a rock gorge after seeing a huge figure carrying a person. Ethan understood that Bigfoot had taken Caleb to remove him from an armed hunter, not to keep him. A black notebook in the camp listed local missing person cases, later found alive. Many entries carried the note. The big one leads them out. Caleb Mercer's name and that day's date were already written on the final page, although his disappearance had never been publicly announced. The giant tracks descended into a dry creek bed enclosed by steep rock. Ahead, Caleb's weak voice confirmed he was conscious. Around a boulder, they found the Bigfoot kneeling in a dry recess. Caleb rested behind it under leaves and pine branches. The creature breathed heavily, one hand braced against the ground. Ethan's pressure bandage held awkwardly against its wound. Caleb said it had carried him away after the second shot, repeatedly changing direction while watching for pursuit. A rifle cracked from a ledge. The bullet hit rock beside the creature. It turned and used its back to shield Caleb. A camouflaged man appeared above and introduced himself as Silas Vane. He had tracked the creatures for 6 years and believed the wounded male was the only adult appearing regularly in the region. One body, he said, would make him famous. Ethan warned that Caleb was in the line of fire. Silas promised rescuers could take Caleb after he finished. Laura slipped toward a side passage to climb the ledge, while Mason kept Silas talking. The Bigfoot could have escaped through the rear, but continued covering Caleb whenever the rifle moved. Water began rising through the gorge, and landslide sounds blocked the exit. Then the lean creature appeared behind Silas with a young one clinging to its back. Silas turned his weapon toward them. The wounded giant charged from the recess, leaving Caleb without cover. The giant roared and drew Silas's aim away from the young one. Laura threw a rock into his arm as he fired, sending the shot into the cliff. The lean creature retreated with the juvenile, but kept looking back. The wounded male, deliberately, made itself the target so the others could escape. Ethan and Mason rushed to Caleb, secured him in the soft stretcher, and began pulling him toward higher ground as floodwater climbed. Laura grappled with Silas, while Mason moved to help her, leaving Ethan to drag Caleb. A floating log struck Ethan's shin, and the stretcher began sliding into the current. The Bigfoot turned, caught the strap, and pulled both Ethan and Caleb onto rock, with one powerful, controlled motion. Its huge hand gripped the frame while avoiding Caleb's injured ankle. At close range, Ethan saw amber eyes that were focused, exhausted, and fully aware of the person needing protection. Silas drew a handgun. Ethan stepped between him and the creature, saying he would have to shoot a federal ranger first. The lean Bigfoot threw a stone into Silas's shoulder. His shot struck the cracked wall, releasing rock. A slab hit the wounded giant and knocked it into the flood. Caleb screamed as the dark body vanished. Then downstream, one huge hand surfaced and clung to a sinking ledge. Mason and Laura pulled Caleb to higher ground. Ethan watched the creature's fingers slip on moss. His duty was to Caleb, but he could not ignore the animal that had shielded him, guided rescuers, and saved the stretcher. Caleb said the creature had chosen to save him again and again. Ethan anchored a rope and entered the rising water. The Bigfoot gave a weak rumble, but did not resist as Ethan looped rope around its arm without touching the chest wound. Mason joined him. Laura fixed a pulley to the stretcher frame, and together they hauled the huge body onto the bank. Ethan removed the rope and backed away. Silas reappeared with the handgun, furious that Ethan was destroying history's greatest evidence. Laura ordered him to drop it. On the upper slope, the lean creature appeared with the young one. It called softly. The wounded giant opened its eyes and tried to stand. Helicopter rotors became audible through the clouds. Silas knew his chance was ending and raised the gun. Tree knocks exploded from 4 directions. Through the fog, several enormous figures appeared around the gorge. At least 5 shapes stood on surrounding slopes, all watching the wounded adult and the juvenile. Silas's control vanished. He was one man inside the territory of a community he did not understand. Laura ordered him to surrender. Ethan said proof meant nothing if purchased with human life. The wounded giant stood between Silas and the young one, despite leaning from blood loss. The other figures held position, apparently respecting its boundary. A stone landed beside Silas's boot, close enough to spray mud, but deliberately missing him. A short call from the wounded male made the lean adult pull the juvenile back. Laura offered Silas the choice to leave in handcuffs instead of forcing events beyond rescue. Finally, he lowered the weapon. Laura arrested him while Mason removed the magazine. Only then did the surrounding knocks fade. The giant approached Ethan, picked up Caleb's camera from beside a rock, and placed it in Ethan's palm, as though returning human property before closing the encounter. The rescue team carried Caleb toward a clearing where the helicopter could lower a line. The wounded Bigfoot moved parallel through the forest, sometimes hidden, sometimes visible in the mist. The other individuals separated and took the young one back into dense trees, while the large male followed Caleb toward the human boundary. It stopped behind a line of fallen trees and rested a hand on the wood, choosing not to go farther. Caleb asked the team to pause and thanked it. The creature sat beyond the barrier, watching until the handover was complete. Ethan placed medical supplies and water on a rock, but the Bigfoot touched the bag and pushed it back, perhaps rejecting exchange or signaling that the encounter should end without debt. Then it picked up a flat stone, crossed by a white line, approached the stretcher, and placed the stone on Caleb's chest. It remained until the helicopter lifted Caleb from the ground. As Ethan rose after him, he looked down and saw the giant standing on a misty rock before disappearing. Mason pointed out dozens of broken branches, forming a clear route from Caleb's shelter to the extraction site. The rescue path had been prepared hours before. The creature seemed to know where they needed to go before the team did. At the hospital in Sevierville, doctors diagnosed a severe sprain, mild hypothermia and dehydration. They said the windbreak, dry leaves and water had probably prevented a life-threatening decline. Caleb kept the white-lined stone in his hand. Silas was charged with illegal hunting, weapons violations, sabotage of communications, and endangering rescuers, but public statements described only an illegal bear hunting case. References to the creatures were removed. Ethan, Mason, and Laura were interviewed separately and encouraged not to use the word Bigfoot. Ethan refused to alter his description, merely to make it easier to accept. Mason confirmed the broken tree bridge, the warnings, and the rescue from floodwater. Hair from the camera strap contained mixed environmental DNA and a damaged root, preventing identification. The blood-stained bullet disappeared from evidence before analysis. Park authorities required confidentiality about the location and unpublished details. Ethan understood that secrecy protected both the park and the creatures from hunters and crowds. Caleb sent his memory card for recovery. Mason began reviewing old reports he once dismissed. Laura found a 1987 case involving a missing child discovered inside a nearly identical windbreak. A handwritten note at the bottom read, "It brought someone back again." Over the following weeks, Ethan searched the old park archives. He found missing person cases with the same pattern, injured victims surviving beyond what weather conditions should have allowed. A woman in 1994 awoke to a refilled water bottle, although she had been unable to move. A boy found in 2002 said a very big hairy person sat outside and knocked on trees whenever he cried. A hunter in 1971 survived after searchers followed branches broken more than 8 feet high. Individually, every report had an easy explanation: delirium, wind damage, or an unknown volunteer. Together, those explanations weakened. Ethan and Mason identified 17 cases sharing at least 3 features: food left near shelter, stones pointing a direction, and something walking beside rescuers beyond their lights. They met retired Ranger Henry Bell, who had signed the 1987 report. Henry initially refused to discuss it until Ethan placed Caleb's white-lined stone on the table. Henry removed a nearly identical stone from his pocket. Older rangers, he said, had long known of a creature that sometimes watched searches and guided rescuers to survivors. They never considered it a friend, but silence prevented hunters and crowds from entering the valleys. Henry warned that individuals differed. Some protected, some avoided people, and some became violent around territory or young. The guide Ethan met might have lived since those earlier cases, or the role might pass through generations. Henry's old map showed rescue sites forming an arc around the same valley where Caleb disappeared. Months later, Caleb returned to Sugarlands carrying the restored memory card. Only one image survived. It showed a foggy forest at dusk, tilted by movement. Behind a tree at the left stood a tall form with broad shoulders, low head, and arms hanging near the knees. A technician called it possibly shadow, overlapping trunks, or image corruption. The timestamp placed it nearly an hour before Caleb fell. The creature had been watching from the main trail. Caleb asked whether it had tried to lure him away. Ethan answered that the evidence showed Caleb had pursued it while it retreated. It returned only after he was injured. Caleb accepted responsibility, created a fund for search and rescue equipment, and promised to keep the location secret. Ethan changed how he trained new rangers. He never taught Bigfoot as official fact, but told them to record purposeful signs, high broken branches, directional stones, and displayed belongings. The following year, Ethan and Mason searched for an elderly woman missing near the same valley. They found a water bottle standing on a rock and 3 stones forming an arrow. They followed immediately and found her alive beneath a rock shelter, with huge tracks fading in the rain. She said something had remained in the forest all night, knocking whenever she tried to leave. As the team carried her down, Ethan saw a giant shape on a misty ledge. He kept his camera in his pocket and placed a hand over his chest, repeating the gesture the creature had once made. The shape stood still, then turned into the forest. Ethan finally understood that rescue teams had never worked alone in those valleys. Humans carried radios, medicine, and stretchers. The creature carried routes, signals, and the ability to find the lost before any map could. Ethan had once believed he was the first to reach Caleb. In the end, he knew his team had simply been guided to where Caleb was waiting.